So let's talk about Stratcom. United States Strategic Command. If you read the Unified Command Plan, what you'll find is you'll find Stratcom listed as a functional combatant command. I actually chafe every time I read that. That is not the way I perceive my command. It's not the way the people in my command perceive ourselves. We see ourselves as a global warfighting command. And if you look at the soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines that operate in that command, 184,000 of them today, they don't see themselves as a functional combatant command. They see themselves as a warfighting command that show up every day to do a warfighting mission. That is what we do. And we have that mission with 3 priorities. And I'll tell you the 3 priorities right up front. I ask you to just listen to the words and then frame in your mind what you think those words mean. So our first priority, above all else, we will provide a strategic deterrent. Priority number 2, if deterrence fails, we will provide a decisive response, and decisive in every way that word can mean. And priority number 3, we will do that with a combat-ready force, trained, equipped, and resilient to any threat that they face. That's who we are. And when you hear those words, most people, probably even most people in this room, go right to the nuclear mission. And that is priority number 1. The nuclear deterrent is priority number 1. If you are in a command that has all the global nuclear capabilities of our nation, that better be priority number 1. But that is not the only thing that provides our strategic deterrent. That's not the only thing that provides a decisive response, and that's not the only thing we have to be combat ready for. Those priorities apply to every one of the missions, and you heard General Dickinson just a few minutes ago start walking through those missions. Nukes, space, cyber, missile defense, analysis and targeting, EW, global strike, 7 different missions. But all those missions have those priorities. I don't want to ever face a nuclear weapon in combat. Nobody should. We have to deter that. But if it happens, we have to be ready to respond. I don't want to face war that extends into space. If war extends into space, we have to figure out how to fight and win that conflict. But real quick, there's no such thing as war in space. It's just war. It's not war against space, it's war against an adversary. And if somebody extends war into space, the problem is with the adversary. It's not with the place. And we have to figure out how to fight the adversary using everything the United States can bring to bear against the problem. And if you want to look at the missile defenders that are sitting alert right now at Greeley in Alaska, the missile defenders that are sitting alert in Colorado Springs, the missile defenders that are sitting in California, they are doing those 3 priorities. Priority number 1, above all else, they will provide a strategic deterrent. Because the fact that they are there provides a deterrent to the adversary that we're facing in North Korea. A significant deterrent. Because what are the elements of deterrence? The elements of deterrence go all the way back to Herman Kahn and Thomas Schelling in the 1960s. The elements of deterrence haven't changed. The elements of deterrence are you have to have the ability to deny benefit to an adversary, impose costs on an adversary, and communicate that credibly to the adversary. Those are the 3 elements of deterrence. And what do you think those soldiers are doing every day on alert? They're doing the same fundamental mission that the missileers that are at F.E. Warren, Minot, and Malmstrom are doing every day. Their first mission is to prevent that missile from being fired against us. Their second mission is to make sure if that missile is fired, they can shoot it down. And the third piece of that puzzle is they have to be combat ready every day in order to do that. So when you hear the priorities of U.S. Strategic Command, strategic deterrence, decisive response, and combat ready, that applies to every element of our force. And so don't just think about nukes when you think about U.S. Strategic Command. You have to think about all those pieces coming together. But the thing you have to remember is strategic deterrence in the 21st century is wholly different than it was in the 20th century. And as a nation, we struggle making that connection. We struggle in many ways understanding what 21st century deterrence really means. Somehow, many people think that under the New START Treaty, we have 1,550 deployed nuclear weapons around the world, and that deters all of our adversaries. That is not true. It is not true. It does not. It is the starting point for the deterrence, but everything else has to be laid on top in order to provide an effective deterrence. We have to figure out how to integrate all those things. Look at the world. The world is wholly different. The world, when Barry and I were looking at it, the threat was the Soviet Union. That's what we were building those capabilities for. It was all about the Soviet Union. That program went away when the wall came down. A lot of programs went away when the wall came down. But we were focused on a single adversary, and the primary threat was nukes. They were going into space. We were going to have to figure out how to deal with that, but it was really primarily a nuclear threat, and that's what we're going to have to do. President Reagan started to change that in the speech in 1983, where he announced the Strategic Defense Initiative. He announced going after it a different way, trying to change the structure, trying to bring in another element to the deterrent equation. And he did. And that capability, combined with everything else we were doing, helped us win the Cold War, but did not end the threat from missiles or nuclear weapons. And our adversaries have been watching us as time has been going on. It's really interesting when you look at the history of how our country looks at the world and what we've been doing over the last 25, 30 years. Since we left that office together, Barry, it's just interesting where the world has gone. Because we went through a period from 1990 to 2000 where we were struggling with what is the threat, where is the threat? And then in 2000 we came up with a concept called capabilities-based development and planning. And most people in this room are old enough to remember capability-based development and planning because that became the mantra. And it was really based on a functional analysis of requirements. And it was based because there was no identifiable threat. Russia was our friend. China was not an adversary. North Korea was not a threat. We actually said those words. But the adversaries were watching us at the same time. And they did not look at it the same way. And we started this capability-based planning process, and the first problem with capability-based planning was during that entire period, there was still a threat. And if you started the nuclear piece was there the entire time. And why did people have nuclear weapons still in their inventory? Because they were our friends? That doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Nope, they still had nuclear weapons because they were there to threaten the United States of America. And you can go all the way back to 1999, 2000. Vladimir Putin is elected president of Russia in 2000. 4 months into his term, he makes a speech, and in that speech he announces a fundamental change to Russian doctrine. And that Russian doctrine now changes to say that the Russians now believe that in response to a conventional battlefield situation that is not going well, Russia will consider the use of low-yield nuclear weapons on a battlefield in order to change the equation. That is not a new piece of information. That was announced by Putin in 2000 and has been consistent for the next 18 years. That is part of the Russian doctrine today. 2006, he announced that we're going to modernize, the Russians are going to modernize 70% of their nuclear strategic force by the year 2000. And then in 2015, Rogozin announces we're actually doing better than that. We're going to get to 100% modernized by 2000. Where are we as the United States? Very close to 0% modernized, although we're starting down that path. Over the last 3 years, we put the modernization plans in place. But when we look at deterrence and we look at the whole, the threat has always been there. The second problem with capability-based planning is that we announced our capabilities to the world. We told them exactly what we were doing, exactly what we're building, and then we showed them on the battlefield for the last 15 years how those things worked. We demonstrated exactly what our concepts were, what our operations were, and they watched. So why are the Chinese building significant counter space capabilities, ground-based, space-based, jamming? Why are they building those capabilities? Because they're our friends? No, they're building those capabilities to threaten the United States of America. They're building those capabilities because they watch what we've done for the last few years. They are creating a significant concern for us. That is not a concern today. Today we are still the most powerful, dominant military force on the planet, and there's no doubt that in any conflict today we would be superior in that conflict. But everybody in this room should be worried about 10 years from now. Will we still be in that place? Will we still be in the place where we can control any kind of escalation, control any kind of military conflict? That should be the goal of this country. We should never get into a place where we're in an even fight, we're in a fair fight. We should always be in a dominant position, because that allows us and our nation to reach out to our allies and do the things that we need to do in this world. So capability-based planning was really bankrupt at the beginning. We just didn't see it coming. Because the threat is there, and our adversaries have been watching. And when you put those pieces together, that means we have to respond. And we have to respond quickly. And strategic deterrence is, how do I integrate all of the elements in the new threat environment that we have in the world? It is a threat-based problem, and we have to have threat-based planning and threat-based answers to how we're going to do that business. And we're walking down that path now. We've gone back, and if you look at the recent nuclear posture review, what you'll see is a threat-based view of nuclear weapons. And I look at the nuclear posture, and I had a significant hand in writing the nuclear posture that comes out, and I think it's a very good document. I think it addresses the nuclear threat exactly right. I think it's the way a strategy should be written, with end, ways, and means all the way through. It has very specific recommendations based on the threat, because as a combatant commander, I can't look at the world the way I wish it was. I have to look at the world the way it is and deal with that threat that is out there, and the nuclear posture review does just that. But I do have some concerns of the nuclear posture review. But it's actually to do with nothing that's in the document. Everything that's in the document, I support. The only problem I have with the nuclear posture review is that the missile defense review is a separate document. And when I look at strategic deterrence in the 21st century, it's a combination of all our capabilities. And right up front is offense and defense. If you look at deterrence, it's the integration of offense and defense. And we're taking our time right now to get the missile defense review right, to make sure it's aligned with the nuclear posture review. And I'm confident now, with Secretary Root and Secretary Mattis and Secretary Shanahan looking at it, that we're going to be aligned with those things coming through. But the fact that we kept those two pieces separate going on tells you that our nation doesn't fully embrace what 21st century deterrence really means. Because if we did, it'd not only be offense and defense, but it'd be space and cyber. It'd be all the elements, all the strategic elements of our national power to deter strategic conflict with our adversaries. Because a couple of interesting things, every time we do a major scale exercise, whether we Stratcom exercise with UCOM or PACOM or the Joint Staff or whoever it is, there's a couple of things that should be important findings to everybody in this room. The first piece is that when we exercise, we realize we get to a certain point, especially if you're exercising against what would be a peer competitor, that you get to a point where you don't want to escalate. And you have to ask yourself, what are priorities? And the number one priority for our nation's defense, and the chairman said it as we walked through an exercise almost exactly a year ago now, it was a global lightning exercise. He looked at what was going on and he said, everybody take a step back. Everybody's worried about the conventional fight and all this kind of stuff. What is our number one priority? Our number one priority is to deter the use of nuclear weapons, to prevent the use of nuclear weapons on ourselves or our allies, and prevent the catastrophic space or cyberspace activity that would damage this nation. That's our number one priority. And if that's our number one priority, then we have to be structured in order to do that. We have to make sure that we work together with UCOM and together with PACOM to make sure we deter, we respond, and we're combat ready all the time. It has to be all of us working together. That is global integration in a nutshell. And the second thing that comes out every time we do this exercise is that as soon as you get into any kind of fight with somebody who is a near peer or peer competitor, you run out of missile defense assets like that. Just like that. So, how are we going to deal with those issues? The first issue is we better figure out how to integrate our global capabilities together. And the chairman is convinced that global integration is the key. All the combatant commanders agree with that. We're moving down the path of global integration. We're working towards, as soon as late this year, to have a fully integrated global exercise where all of those stress points are established. Because it's not just the missile defense things that become a challenge. Tankers become a challenge. There's so many global assets that become a challenge in this kind of environment. And most everybody that wears a uniform today, over 90% of the people that wear a uniform today, never had to think about a strategic peer adversary. They've never had to think about losing air superiority. They've never had to think about losing space superiority. That has never been part of their equation. And when you actually have to think about those things are really, really hard to do. And the air and missile defense elements that we're going to talk about today, that you're going to talk about on the panels, are key to moving that forward in the future. So what do we have to do in missile defense? Well, missile defense, we need to improve a number of things. From a global missile defense capability, I think the highest priority, in my opinion, is improved sensors. And we're going to build a new radar in Alaska. Missile Defense Agency is building the LRDR, the Long Range Discrimination Radar in Alaska. That's a critical piece of the puzzle. We continue to improve radars across the board. Radars are a critical element of our architecture. But I'll tell you what, there's not enough ships, there's not enough islands in the Pacific that radars can answer all your sensor questions. We're going to have to go to space to actually do the mid-course discrimination element of this mission. And the Missile Defense Agency knows how to do that. They have a plan to do that. We're struggling to get started with it. It's taken way too long. It's called the mid-course tracking sensor. The great thing about the mid-course tracking sensor is that it will be able to discriminate the mid-course phase of the problem. But the other thing it'll be able to do is, because of that sensor technology, it's going to be able to look down and see some of the new emerging threats, like hypersonics, that are challenging to us because we've built an architecture that is primarily focused on the ballistic missile characterization of a threat. And so our adversaries have been watching that again. And that's why they're going down hypersonics and maneuvering reentry vehicles and all the other pieces. Those are counters to us. So we have to counter them. We need better kill vehicles. We need more reliable kill vehicles on the front end. We need multi-object kill vehicles on the front end of our interceptors. We need more capacity in the interceptors. But we need to work all those things in unison. And those are the priorities that I have. Sensors, better kill vehicles, and then capacity. That's how we should go down that path and build it in the future. And the interesting thing about the missile defense piece is that we've had fits and starts. Certain areas we have gone unbelievably fast. You look at CRAM, counter-rocket artillery mortar system. You know, basically the threat was there in 2005. Requirement was developed 3 months. A year later, the Navy phalanx and some RV sensors integrated into a system with an integrated command and control deployed. 12 months, basically, from start to finish in theater with a new weapon system. Since then, over 7,000 warrants, 375 actual engagements. That's a remarkable capability, and that's going fast. We have to be able to go fast. And my biggest concern about this entire structure is that in so many places, we've kind of lost the ability to go fast. Oh my gosh, we take forever to do anything anymore. And our adversaries are not suffering the same problem. That's why, even though we are dominant today, and I expect to be dominant for at least a decade, if we don't figure out how to go fast again, our adversaries will catch up. And so there's 5 areas where we have to go fast. General Ham talked about one of them a while ago. That's the budget. We've got to have a budget at the first of the year. If we don't have a budget at the first of the year, in not too long, our nation, I can't think of another way to put it, we will be screwed. It's just that straightforward. You know, I like to tell strategic stories since I'm Strategic Command, and I like to tell the story of Rickover in the Navy, Schriever in the Air Force, and how fast they went. Schriever built the new ICBM 5 years, $2.14 billion. 800 three-stage solid rocket ICBMs and 800 new missile holds in 5 states across the country, 5 Air Force bases that didn't exist when he started. From square one to deployed and operational in 5 years. Rickover took a reactor that was the size of this building and put it on a 28-foot submarine and deployed it in 5 years. If you take that $2.14 billion that Schriever had and you mark it forward into the future, that's $17 billion in today's money. The new Minuteman replacement, the GBSD, current estimate, 400 missiles, IOC 2029, FOC 2035, and current estimates roughly $84 billion. That's not going fast. That is not going fast. You look at all the capabilities we have to figure out how to go fast, and it starts with a budget. But then it goes into requirements. I just talked about the CRAM requirements, 3 months. I can sit down with 3 subject matter experts in any one of my areas, from nuke to missile defense, and if I sit down with them, I can get you a good requirements document inside 3 months. Did it with CRAM? Everything should be that urgent. It shouldn't take longer than 3 months to get a requirement for anything, and it should be threat-based to counter that threat and build it against that threat. But we take sometimes 3 years in the requirements process to get the requirements done. And I've talked to the vice chairman. He's a good friend of mine. The vice chairman, he'll get it through inside 3 months every time. All you have to do is get through the process and ask him. But it takes our attention. We can't just let the process work. Then the acquisition business. The acquisition business. Used to be the acquisition business was run by colonels. And the colonels were given the authorities and responsibilities to go fast. And they took risks, and sometimes they failed, and sometimes they were fired. They don't have those responsibilities anymore. All the responsibilities have moved in the Pentagon. The good news is Secretary Shanahan, Secretary Lord, they're moving stuff back out to the field. They're moving back out and putting authorities in the hands, but we have to allow them to really take risk and move out, because those are the last two. You know, when we test, we don't have any risk assessment anymore. There's an Army example of THAAD. If you look back at the history of THAAD, and the history of THAAD is pretty old, actually. A lot of people in the room think THAAD is a brand new weapon system, but THAAD actually went through development 1995, 1999, and during that period, 1995 to 1999, 6 failures. 6 failures in a row. That's pretty significant. You know, General Schriever, the hero of the Air Force space and missile business, first time he tried to build the first spy satellite, Discover, Corona, failed 13 times in a row. Sometimes he's a hero. But 13 times in a row he failed. The program director for THAAD back in the 90s was Colonel Lou Dieter. And he had a great quote at the end. You know, as he went through those failures and he finally got to the place where he finished, he looked and he said, "We knew where we were going. We just had to be allowed to complete the journey." And I ask you today, if you had a program that went 4 years with 6 failures, do you think everybody would say, "Yep, keep going"? Imagine a world without THAAD today. Imagine where we had a world where we couldn't put THAAD on the Korean Peninsula to defend our southern bases and ports. Imagine a world where we couldn't put THAAD on Guam to defend the critical assets that are there on Guam. Imagine a world where that didn't exist. That's a world I don't want to be part of. But if we have to get back to where we allow our program directors to take risks. We have to get back to where we allow failure in the right way. And each of those failures, if you look back at it, there was component failures, there was process failures, but each one was a learning experience to fix the weapon system. So the weapon system, when it came online, it would work. Rickover had a great quote. I shared it with a number of folks over the years, but Rickover's quote was, "Success teaches nothing. Failure teaches everything." And it's true if you do it the right way. It's not to take risk that's foolish. It's not just to test to fail. You don't try to test to fail, but you try to test to push the envelope. You try to test, because if you actually get in a threat situation and you're on the peninsula and THAAD is brought to bear or the GBIs are brought to bear, they have to work. And in order to work, you have to push the envelopes and test, and that means that you will suffer failures in tests, and each one of those failures would be a learning experience that you can bring to bear on an adversary. That's how you get to a capability that will work. And we have to do that. We have to go back to understanding risk, understanding how to test, understanding acquisition, understanding requirements, getting a budget and moving fast. That's what our nation is calling us to do. But holy cow, the missile defense business is an exciting business. And more than any other element in our country, the missile defense business can look at programs and find examples of exactly those 5 things. So you know that it works. You know that it's there. The way Jim ended his remarks is perfect, because it's really all about the soldiers. We should never put a soldier in the field with equivalent or less capabilities to our adversaries. The equipment that they're given when they deploy, and oh, by the way, the soldiers in Alaska are deployed right now. When they're deployed, that equipment should be the best that the United States can bring to bear. Not good enough, not equal, superior, and dominant. There are sons and daughters. It's criminal if we don't give them the best. That's what we have to do. Because I've been a general a long time now. I never expected to be a general to begin with, but I sure as hell never expected to be a 4-star. But my son, about 5 years ago, he looked at me and he said, "Dad, I've been watching you ever since you made general." And I realized, you don't do any real work anymore. And it kind of torqued me off when he said it, because, man, I feel like I work hard. But the more I thought about it, he's exactly right. I don't do any of the real work anymore. The soldiers on the pictures that General Dickinson put up, they do the real work. The airmen, sailors, and Marines, the sailors that are underway on the Alabama today, underway on the Tennessee, underway in the Pennsylvania, they do the real work. The airmen that are under the ground in the missile fields, they do the real work. The soldiers that sit and alert in Colorado Springs, reaching out to the missile defense guys in Alaska and California, they do the real work. Our job is to make sure that we lead them effectively. We make sure they have the right stuff. We train them so that they are combat ready when our nation calls. And if we do the job right, we will deter every adversary on the planet. And if we do it wrong, we'll have to bring a decisive response to bear. And if we bring a decisive response to bear, it better be decisive. That's who we are. That's U.S. Stratcom, and that's the missile defense business. So I thank you for your time this morning. I'll be glad to take questions.